I think I started noticing it in small ways. A glance that lingered just a little longer than it should have, or the warmth of his hand on my shoulder staying there for a beat too long. Little things that, when I look back, make me realize there was always a deeper connection between us, one that made me feel safe and cherished. Maybe I had always been looking for that feeling. As his adopted daughter, I came into this family carrying shadows from a life before, a past I didn't often talk about and feelings I tried to leave behind. Dad made me feel like I belonged. From the start, he was the one who sat up with me on the hard nights, the one who knew just when to reach out for my hand when I felt lost. I loved how he made life feel whole, pieced together in the ways I didn't know were possible. In those early days, I didn't think too much of it. He was simply my dad, my rescuer, and the person I looked up to most in the world. But as I grew older, the closeness we shared began to deepen, taking on a different shape. It wasn't a shift I was aware of at first, and even now I'm not sure when things changed. Sometimes I tell myself it's only my imagination. After all, we've always been close. He's always been there for me. But lately, I've felt this invisible thread between us growing tighter, binding us in ways I never thought possible or even proper. I remember one particular day, an ordinary afternoon that somehow changed everything. We were sitting on the back porch, our usual spot for lazy Sunday mornings. I had my coffee and he was reading the paper, but every now and then he'd look up and ask me about my week, asking the questions that showed how deeply he cared. I felt myself relaxing, opening up to him the way I never could with anyone else. I told him about my small victories, my frustrations, my dreams. He listened to everything as if it were the most important thing in the world, as if he wanted to know all of me. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, I remember feeling a strange sense of peace settle over me, a warmth that felt almost too good, too comfortable, like I could stay there forever and it would still be too short. I glanced over, and he was already looking at me, his gaze soft yet intense. There was nothing wrong with it on the surface. I told myself it was just an ordinary moment between us. But somehow I felt as if he could see past every barrier I had ever put up, straight into the core of who I was. That was when I realized it. The closeness we shared wasn't just typical father-daughter affection. It was something that felt fuller, deeper, and maybe even sacred. And I couldn't shake the feeling that we both knew it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I replayed everything in my head, dissecting each moment, wondering if I'd imagined the depth in his gaze, or the way his hand had rested on mine for just a few seconds longer than usual. And then, feeling guilty for even thinking that way, I convinced myself that it was just my mind overcomplicating things. But those thoughts kept coming back, no matter how much I tried to bury them. I'd notice how he'd smile whenever I entered the room, how his hand would linger on my shoulder when he was about to leave, how he'd come find me to talk even when he seemed exhausted after a long day. And every time I'd feel this gentle tug on my heart, a quiet yearning that left me breathless and confused. Over time, I started to see how much of my own heart I'd laid bare to him, probably without even realizing it. I found myself talking to him in ways I didn't with anyone else, sharing my fears, my worries, the secret parts of myself I didn't let out. And he'd listen with such patience, with a kind of focus that made me feel like he would always be there for me no matter what. He made me feel understood, seen, like I mattered in a way that made all my uncertainties fade. One evening, after he'd come back from a late meeting, I was sitting on the living room floor with a blanket wrapped around me, reading a book. I looked up to see him watching me from the doorway, his eyes softer than I'd ever seen them, his shoulders sagging like he'd had a long, exhausting day. He came over, sat down beside me, and for a while we just sat there in silence. It wasn't the words I remember from that night, though we did talk a little. It was the way he looked at me, the tenderness in his gaze, like I was someone irreplaceable in his life. There was an ache behind that gaze, something that almost hurt to look at, and for a moment I had to look away, feeling too seen, too vulnerable. But he didn't say anything, just leaned back beside me, close enough that I could feel his presence like a warmth wrapping around me. In the weeks that followed, that closeness became like a quiet undercurrent, flowing between us without words. I think we both felt it but were afraid to acknowledge it, maybe because neither of us wanted to change anything. Our connection felt forbidden, yes, but also like something beautiful and fragile that we wanted to protect. There was a comfort in knowing that we shared something special, something that no one else could understand. But sometimes I wonder if he ever notices the way I catch myself smiling when he walks into the room or the soft look I try to hide whenever he glances my way. I wonder if he knows how much those moments mean to me, how I hold on to every small kindness he shows me, the little things that build up in my heart like a secret I'm both proud and ashamed of carrying. I don't know if he feels it the same way. I don't know if he ever wonders what our closeness means, or if he, too, has felt the boundaries between us shift in ways neither of us dared acknowledge. It's confusing and comforting all at once. And sometimes I feel selfish for even letting myself feel this way, as if I'm betraying something sacred by holding on to these quiet moments, by letting them mean so much to me. But as much as I tell myself to let it go, to see him only as my dad, I can't quite stop. Because every time he looks at me with that same soft, tender gaze, every time his hand lingers just a moment too long, I feel myself sink a little deeper, into a connection that feels both perfect and profoundly forbidden. And even if it's something we'll never speak about, something that will always stay between us like an unspoken vow, I can't bring myself to walk away from it. I don't think I want to. It started in the smallest, most innocent ways that might not even seem significant if I tried to explain them out loud. But for us, each tiny gesture felt magnified, like it was part of a language we both knew but didn't want to admit to understanding. A brush of his hand against mine as he handed me a cup of tea, a lingering hug after a long day, the way he'd tuck my hair behind my ear while we talked. These things had always been there, but now I was noticing them with a heightened awareness that left me both eager and wary. One evening, we were sitting together on the couch, as we often did, watching a movie. It was a quiet night, the house dim and calm, just the two of us. I was curled up beside him, close enough that our arms brushed every now and then. Touch sent little sparks through me, even though I kept telling myself it was nothing, just a casual closeness. But as the movie played, I felt his arm rest gently around my shoulders, pulling me just a little closer. I tensed at first, not out of fear but because of how my heart raced in that instant. He must have sensed it because he pulled his arm back, but I quickly reached out, stopping him before he could fully let go. "It's okay," I murmured, keeping my voice steady as I settled back into the warmth of his embrace. He didn't say anything, just let his arm rest around me once again, and we stayed that way in a quiet bubble of our own. When the movie ended, neither of us moved right away. The house was silent, save for the hum of the heater, and I found myself lost in the warmth and comfort of his presence. I felt his hand brush my arm softly, tracing gentle circles that felt like they carried a meaning all their own, a tenderness I hadn't felt from anyone else. I closed my eyes, letting the sensation wash over me, trying to understand why it felt so perfect yet so precarious. I looked up at him, feeling as if I needed to say something, to acknowledge the intimacy of the moment, but his gaze met mine before I could speak. There was a softness in his eyes, something that seemed to mirror what I felt, as if he too was grappling with an emotion that felt out of place and yet exactly right. "Dad," I began, my voice barely a whisper. "Yes." His voice was calm, his expression tender, and I felt my heart tighten as he looked at me. I hesitated, unsure of what I wanted to say. The words felt too big, too complicated, and I didn't even know what I wanted to ask him. But he didn't rush me. He just kept his hand resting softly on my arm, waiting as if he could sense the turmoil running through me. I reached out, my fingers trembling slightly as I touched his hand, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath mine. It was such a small, simple thing, yet it felt like crossing a line I couldn't go back from. I thought he might pull away, that he might realize what was happening and put a stop to it, but he didn't. Instead, he just held my hand in his grip gentle but firm, like he was grounding me, reassuring me. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice a low murmur that seemed to wrap around me like a blanket. I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure if it was the truth. I felt a strange mixture of comfort and fear, an awareness that I was stepping into unfamiliar territory. But being there with him in that quiet moment felt right in a way that was hard to explain. I don't know," I said, my voice trembling as I tried to put words to the emotions swirling inside me. "It's like, I don't know what I'd do without you." He nodded, his gaze softening even more as he looked at me. "I'm here," he said simply, his voice full of a promise I'd heard so many times before. He pulled me closer then, his arms wrapping around me in a hug that felt deeper, more tender than any we'd shared before. I leaned into him, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath my cheek, letting the warmth of his embrace wash over me. I didn't want to let go, didn't want the moment to end, and as we sat there in the quiet, I felt something shift between us, an unspoken understanding that neither of us dared to voice. In the days that followed, our connection only grew stronger, a quiet intimacy that hung between us like a delicate thread. Little by little, we grew bolder, longer hugs, whispered conversations late at night, moments where we'd find ourselves sitting close, just looking at each other, saying nothing yet feeling everything. There was a vulnerability in these moments, a closeness that felt both fragile and unbreakable, as if we'd discovered something sacred between us that no one else could understand. One night, as we were cleaning up after dinner, I felt his hand brush against mine, lingering a moment longer than necessary. I looked up, meeting his gaze, and there was something in his eyes that mirrored what I felt, a quiet longing, a tenderness that went beyond words. He reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear, his fingers grazing my cheek as he did so. My heart raced, and I felt myself lean into his touch, wanting to stay in that moment, to hold on to the warmth of his hand and the softness in his gaze. It was a silent promise, an unspoken understanding, and even though neither of us said a word, I knew we both felt it. This connection between us was something special, something precious and delicate, and I didn't want it to end. I wanted to stay close to him, to keep sharing these quiet moments that felt like they belonged to us alone. There were nights I'd lie awake, replaying these moments in my mind, wondering if he felt the same way, if he too was feeling this deep pull between us. It was confusing, a strange blend of comfort and longing, but I knew I couldn't turn back. Whatever this was, it was ours, and I didn't want to let go. It was one of those nights where my mind wouldn't settle, where thoughts and feelings I tried to push down kept rising up, filling me with a restless energy I couldn't shake. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, hoping that maybe if I closed my eyes long enough, sleep would come. But it didn't. My thoughts kept drifting back to him, to the moments we'd shared, to the way he'd look at me, gentle yet intense, as if I was the only person in the world who mattered. Finally, unable to stay still any longer, I got up and padded softly down the hallway. I hesitated outside his door, my heart pounding as I wondered what I was doing. I could hear his soft breathing from the other side, and it made me feel comforted somehow, like everything would be okay as long as he was near. I took a deep breath and gently turned the knob, pushing the door open just a crack. "Dad," I whispered, feeling a bit silly but needing to be close to him. The room was dark except for the soft glow of the nightlight by the window. He stirred, turning over as he blinked, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. When he saw me, he didn't seem surprised, just lifted his head slightly, an invitation for me to come in. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice warm, filled with that understanding that always seemed to be there when I needed it most. I nodded, feeling the weight of my emotions pressing down on me, and before I could second-guess myself, I crossed the room and sat down beside him. The bed was warm from his presence, and I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me just being there, close to him. He reached out, his hand resting gently on my back, rubbing soothing circles in that comforting way he'd done when I was little and couldn't sleep. I closed my eyes, letting the rhythm of his hand calm me, grounding me in a way nothing else ever could. I leaned into him, feeling the warmth of his body close to mine, and he wrapped an arm around my shoulders, pulling me gently against his chest. The silence between us felt heavy, yet comforting, filled with all the words we didn't say but somehow understood. I let out a shaky breath, feeling the weight of my emotions press closer, and he held me tighter, as if he could feel it too. His hand stroked my hair, gentle and slow, and I felt a warmth spread through me, a feeling of safety and closeness that I'd always cherished. But there was something else too, a tenderness that felt deeper, more intimate than anything I'd felt before. I didn't pull away, I didn't want to. I leaned into his touch, letting myself feel the warmth of his hand on my shoulder, the quiet strength in his embrace. "I'm here," he murmured softly, his voice soothing, and I felt my heart ache at the comfort those words brought me. We stayed that way, close and quiet, wrapped in each other's presence. His hand continued to stroke my back, his touch light yet steady, and I felt a softness settle over me, a gentle warmth that made everything else fade away. It was as if, in that moment, nothing else mattered but the closeness we shared, the quiet understanding that bound us together. For the first time in a long time, I felt completely at peace.